Hi, I'm Caroline.
And I'm Adrienne.
And this is Scandal Sheets. Hello and welcome to Scandal Sheets, the podcast that exposes the scandals and the people associated with them and the places too. Let's not forget about the places.
Those are very important.
They are very important. I am Caroline, your host, and as always
I'm Adrienne.
And today we are bringing you the second part of our series on Stanford White, and now we're getting to the juicy stuff where he got murdered. So
sure,
lots of fun.
Okay,
in front of lots of people.
Right.
So,
but first,
we want to sort of recap from last week. Adrienne did a little bit of a intro into his architectural career, and then I sort of talked about his personal life leading up to his meeting with the woman who would cause all of his troubles, Evelyn Nesbit. Yeah,
the chorus girl.
Right. He had a thing for chorus girls, and unfortunately, that came to bite him in the ass. So.
Doesn't it always?
I know, right? So, Adrienne, you want to kind of give a little quick recap on his architectural endeavors?
Think so. Sure. So, Stanford White, he was an apprentice with Henry Hobson Richardson, who was another big architect of the day, designed Trinity Church in Boston, which is actually when Stanford White was apprenticed to him. And Stanford White had zero architecture training. So at 18, he skips college and just joins Richardson at his firm to learn from the greatest and absorb the literature and look at the pattern books that he has and the images, and is still able to produce some beautiful designs, especially interior architecture in Newport. And then he went to Europe and sort of continued his, I guess, informal or at least non-academic education, alternative training, right?
And that's kind of like the most, I think, fascinating thing about Stanford White is the fact that he had no formal education.
Really, really amazing. So he's doing all this beautiful Gilded Age stuff, and some of his most famous works are the Washington Square Arch downtown, and the NYU Library, which is now in the original campus was in the Bronx. So the building is still there, but it's not used as a library, but it still exists. And it's stunning. It was modeled after the Pantheon in Rome. And so he just sort of took as precedent all these really incredible buildings in Europe that he had visited in the during his stay there between 1878 and 1879. But now, so that's sort of briefly where we were last week. And now talking about the main event, his Madison Square Garden, a very, very grand, of course, no longer existing.
Right. Yeah. We definitely need to specify that it is not the Madison Square Garden that is there today, which, of course, was a massive preservationist defeat in the 60s when they tore down Penn Station to build the new Madison Square Garden. So there was actually 3 before the current one, or 2? 3. Yeah. So this Madison Square Garden stretched back
because it moved. Right, because the one that's there now, the one we're talking about that White designed, is not on the site.
Right.
There was a different building that this Madison Square Garden 2 of 1890 was torn down to build something else that was actually quite beautiful. But, right, so Penn Station is what was demolished for the current Madison Square Garden. Anyway, so much terrible losses.
The one that we're talking about was sort of situated between Broadway and
26th and 27th from Madison to Park.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And actually that whole area I was reading about, it was really popular kind of for people who were going to the theater or coming from the theater. So there were lots of restaurants. Originally, Delmonico's, which was a really famous restaurant, was kind of really the first concept of like high class dining. That was there originally in that same area. They eventually ended up moving to another area of New York as things happen, areas change over and other areas become popular and people follow
Trendy.
that.
Yeah, exactly.
I think in this case, Fifth Avenue was rising in prominence, and so a lot of those original businesses around Madison Square Garden moved over there. So, shut up, Caroline.
No, you're good. That's really good background. I didn't know any of that. So, the Madison Square Garden that White designed had origins in pretty inelegant and humble beginnings. So, in 1837, freight yards for the New York, New Haven, and Harlem railroads, which were owned by the Vanderbilt family.
Oh, those Vanderbilts.
Were constructed on a large piece of property which ran from, as I just mentioned, 26th to 27th Streets and from Madison to Park. Passenger terminal was added in 1857, and the rail yards functioned until 1871. But the area, as Caroline mentioned, had become too fashionable to permit the passage of trains. So these fancy people are very, NIMBYists of all decades, and it wasn't as if anything else about the city at that time was dirty, but they just didn't want trains there.
Yeah.
So the railroad company leased the property to P.T. Barnum, who we all know for circus. So Barnum opened a hippodrome there, and then a popular band leader of the time, name not important, but it was Patrick Gilmore. He transformed it into Gilmore's Gardens. Okay. Again, with the gardens, plantless gardens, of course, offering a wide variety of entertainment. The railroad took over the lease 4 years later, where it was finally named Madison Square Garden. So, unfortunately, it was not the financial success that the owner wanted it to be. And the owner meaning the Vanderbilts. And it was a fire trap. So...
As so many things were back then.
Yeah, and they... It was pointless to spend money to renovate it, and the Vanderbilts wanted to tear it down in order to construct multifamily housing, but apparently a zoning law at the time made what the Vanderbilts wanted to build impossible. Huh. So I thought, at that time with the growth, I thought it was interesting that zoning was not allowing what they want to build, which was a really tall, high density.
Really?
Yeah, multifamily. So I didn't sort of delve into that, but I thought it was weird.
Yeah. Did it say whether or not this multifamily was like tenements or like high, like more like middle class?
I think it was just housing for regular working people. Okay. Yeah.
Interesting.
So a new chapter of the garden's life began when the National Horse Show Committee paid $400,000 for the old arena.
Jeez.
The Madison Square Garden Corporation was born. And one of the purchasers of shares in this new organization was none other than Stanford White. So, always a man of entertainment, who loved entertainment, he wanted to create for the city a new facility for large-scale events, something that they just didn't have up until then. He was able to convince the board that he was the guy to design the new Madison Square Garden, even though his experience on a building of that scale and use was zero. The design of the new Madison Square Garden was made official in the summer of 1887, and fundraising efforts began immediately. Clients contributed to the promise of a majestic new building that White made sketches of, key phrase sketches, illustrating an elaborate Madison Avenue facade and a corner tower that acted as a beacon for the neighborhood. Madison Square Garden was debatably the first great pleasure palace in the country. White became obsessed with making the garden at least as great as the best entertainment palaces he had seen abroad. Unlike the first Madison Square Garden, the new building had additional spaces, including theaters, concert halls, and a restaurant with seating for 1,500, the largest in New York.
Jeez.
There was even a giant rooftop terrace, because, of course, there has to be.
Right.
The main space of the second Madison Square Garden measured 200 feet by 350 feet, the largest in the world at the time. So White designed the new Madison Square Garden, or Madison Square Garden 2, whichever you'd like to say, in the Moorish style, which was just one of the revival styles that he was adept at. The tower was modeled after the campanile of the Giralda in Seville, Spain. Interestingly, Stanford White had never been to Spain himself. Even on his European tour, Spain was not one of the countries that he visited. But its romance and mystery and apparent love for evening activities, again, according to White, the party animal, convinced him that Spanish flair was the way to go for a pleasure garden, and he was not incorrect. So White was desperate to make his mark, and he punctuated this building with a giant tower. The tower was 32 stories, and that made Madison Square Garden to the second tallest skyscraper in the city.
Really? 32 stories?
Mm-hmm. It was over 300 feet, yeah.
Jeez.
Mm-hmm. That's giant.
Yeah.
The tallest skyscraper, and you say skyscraper, but it was a tower. It was usable space. There were rooms in it, but it wasn't like a skyscraper with, offices and what you would think of, because it's tall, but it's not like big. It doesn't take up a giant lot of, corner lot in the city. So it's more just an exclamation point or a beacon.
So it rose out of a certain
correct
part of the building.
Correct. It was on a corner, just like X marks the spot.
Huh.
The tallest skyscraper at that time was architect George Brown Post's New York World Building at 99 Park Row, which was bankrolled by J. Pulitzer. Unfortunately, we can't see that skyscraper these days because it was demolished in 1955.
Of course it was.
Thanks, urban renewal. The tower, interestingly, was not originally in the program. Although if you see pictures of Madison Square Garden, it's hard to imagine the building without it. White didn't want to make a new version of the old freight yards, which was just, a low, wide building. He wanted Madison Square Garden to get the attention it deserved. After all, this was the first pleasure palace in the city. And White had already convinced a bunch of rich white guys he should be the one to design this giant building, so it wasn't much of a stretch to convince them that they should add this tower that was completely useless to the program and ended up being rented out as apartments, mostly to wealthy bachelors or as love nests. And not that I have evidence to that, but I just think it's safe to assume.
Well, I mean, as we will learn in a little bit, he, in fact, had an apartment in the tower that he used for...
He did.
...assignations. I love that word.
That's a good word.
There's your SAT word for the week, folks.
Yeah, we have a lot of those.
I know.
So, fun fact, Andrew Carnegie of Carnegie Mellon fame, right, backed out of the corporation. He was one of the shareholders or whatever of the new Madison Square Garden. He dumped $75,000 worth of shares, after which they had to get the money somehow, so the public was allowed to invest in Madison Square Garden.
Oh, okay.
And it was truly an entertainment house for the people. Carnegie, his reasoning was that he wanted to put his money into more serious stuff and proceeded to establish Carnegie Hall.
Oh, okay. There's that Scotch Presbyterianism for you.
Oh, is that what he was?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he was. Okay. Yeah, kind of stayed. No offense to the Scots, because I am Scottish, so I love Scotland.
Well, I'm Danish, and they're pretty staid too. So,
okay, there you go.
But I have nothing to do with the story. My people do not.
So not this time around.
Not this time, right? J.P. Morgan and Stanford White were the project's biggest cheerleaders, but no construction date was set as late as 1889. Now remember, they had already decided on a design based on White's sketches 2 years prior. So White actually left for Europe to do some research and check out the music halls over there. And in a giant just kidding moment, I love this, construction started right after he left the country.
Uh-oh.
So they're like, oh, we're going to break ground. Bye. And
see you in a couple months.
Yeah. So Stanford dictates the design ideas from overseas, and Meade and their contractor, whose name was David King, had to step in for the absentee architect. The contractor essentially saved the day, completing the main space at Madison Square Garden. This is the giant 200 by 350 foot one or whatever, finished in March of 1890, 3 months late and on budget. This never happens. So